Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Before I start, I first want to thank the organizers, Govinder and Barbara, for the invitation. I welcome the opportunity to talk a little bit about APS and our accomplishments and the directions we head in, especially in this issue of partnering and partnerships. I guess in some sense, my role here, not only in speaking for a society publisher, is probably speaking on the not to partner end, and you'll hear some of the reasons why, and a lot of it has to do with not only my own background, but the background of the society in general, being made up of physicists. I'll talk a little bit about that later, and you'll get an idea. Now, who are we? Well, first off, the APS, as I mentioned, is a member society. We were established in 1899. We have roughly, 50,000 members, some of which, a fifth of which, are international. Now, this is where I wanted to talk a little bit about the APS and physicists in general. Physicists are a different breed. I don't know how many of you have ever worked with physicists, but believe me, we are quite different. We have this instinct not to take things at face value, to always have to do things ourselves, partly because we want to make sure it's done right. That's at least the belief we have. And that we like consistency and repeatability. All right? That's the whole idea of the experimental mode. And so as you'll see here, part of the background that I'm going to give you and part of the impetus for us to do much of the publishing aspects on our own is that this belief that as physicists we can do things well and do things right. Just a little bit more, the core activities of the society I think are like most societies. They're both the publishing and meetings, right? The idea is to disseminate knowledge and have interactions and collaborations, and this is how we do it. And lastly, of course, part of our mission is to work closely with not only the physics community, but sort of society in general to bring physics to the forefront and to acknowledge how it supports society advancements. So our primary publishing is the Physical Review family of journals. As you can see from this little timeline, it started in 1893, so it even predated the society. It was actually in 1913 that the APS took it over. And since then, it's expanded rapidly, especially in recent history, from the single Physical Review journal to, as I said, 11 current journals. As Nawin said, we published roughly 19,000 articles last year. We received 39,000. It adds up to slightly over 150,000 pages of physics. But the question is, you could ask, are we really a large publisher when we compare ourselves to an Elsevier, a Springer, or Taylor and Francis? We're small potatoes. But within the scope of physics, we're actually a fairly large player. If you look at fundamental physics, we're about 16% of the literature. If you look more broadly through physics, we're probably closer to about 9%. So we do have a fairly large portion of the market. So what is the real role of APS publishing? Well, as I noted, our mission statement is the advancement and diffusion of physics knowledge. And so obviously through our publications, this is the diffusion end. So, for our society, of course, publishing plays a major role in how the society works. I just want to note that, we're essentially what holds up the society. We're about 75% of the revenues of the society, and it's our publishing end that allows us to do our good works. But I do want to talk about the history of the society, especially the publishing, and the innovations that we believe we brought into publishing. So, as you saw in my bio, I started with the APS in 1996, so I've been there for almost 20 years. And when I arrived, we had just started moving strongly into the electronic environment. So some of the things we did, both with partners or on our own, was to bring everything into the electronic venue. So, for instance, we took our entire back file all the way back to 1893. We scanned them in. We took the metadata. We converted it to SGML. From that point forward, all our composition work, all our production work was done in SGML. Now, of course, we're in XML. Also, in 1998, we introduced an electronic-only open access journal, Physical Review Special Topics, Accelerators, and Beams. Now, this was back in '98. It was fully open access, completely electronic from submission to publication. No paper, no print was involved at all. We demanded that all authors submitted electronically. Also, as we started approaching the 2000, we started doing e-first publications. So instead of being constrained by page counts, by page numbering, we went to an article ID form. And eventually, we decided that print was sort of an afterthought, where the electronic version was the version of record, and that at the end of the month, we just collected anything that came out electronically for that month and called it an issue, printed it up, and gave it to whoever wanted to use it. And then, as I noted, more recently, we have shifted from SGML to XML, even to the point with our composition vendors, we went to XML first, which meant they brought it in, they converted it to XML, and they did most of their copy editing within that environment. We also introduced some more electronic-only products, in this case physics, which is sort of an overlay on all our journals. It helps us highlight the very best that we publish. Even with pushing out 19,000 articles, it's necessary for physicists to have another way of trying to focus in on what's important. And so one of these ways is through physics and through something called editor suggestions. Also, very recently, 2010, we moved to our own publishing platform, which meant that as we look from submission all the way to final publication, basically the APS did everything except for the copy editing and the XML translations. Everything else, the peer review process, everything else was done in-house. And last year we even brought in circulation and fulfillment, and we developed mobile-friendly websites. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of doing everything ourselves, or more specifically, what I have, I think, sort of brought into the single pro and the single con. And the pro is control. If you do it yourself, you have control, right? You have the ability to make technology work specifically within your workflow rather than being guided by the technology being offered from outside. And so one example of it is, when I first arrived at APS, this was our manuscript database, right? Everything was in folders, everything was paper-based. We had very strict guidelines on how instructions were passed, right? It'd go from an editor to an operations support person who would send it out. It would go into storage. It would come back out when a piece of information came in. I mean, this is our database. That folder contained everything about a particular manuscript. The manuscript, all the correspondence, referee reports, etc. In 2003, 2005, we were able to turn it all electronic. So now, over your cup of coffee and New York Times in the morning, you can actually peruse the database. You can handle editorial actions. I could be working in between sessions today doing editorial actions. Now, what's exciting here is, as I said, is the control aspect. Our electronic peer review process became tightly integrated with exactly the way we used to do workflow. The message passing, the workflow, how things are interconnected. And as this process grew, we're able to then interconnect everything. So our author database is interacting with our referee database, which is actually interacting with our publishing platform. And so everything is integrated very specifically for the way we do business to highlight and expand upon our efficiencies. Also, by doing it ourselves, we're able to offer new services to our readers and to society in general. So, for instance, in 2010, 2011, it was fairly straightforward, fairly easy for us to decide that we wanted to make our work accessible by the public. And so once we got the rules set down, it was very easy for us on our very own platform to make all our content freely accessible to anyone who walks into a U.S. public library or any student who's at a U.S. public high school. So having this type of control, this type of subtlety, and being able to do it on our own time frame and not on anyone else's has been a great advantage to us. We've also been able to then coordinate our efforts with other publishers and organizations, ORCID, Chorus, which is the clearinghouse of open research in the U.S. And because we had the control over our content, we were actually able to come up with a pilot for Chorus last October. With just about a month's notice, we were able to get most of our content tagged properly and made freely available. So this was the author's final version, which was contained in our database. We were able to display. So of the thousands of articles they had prepped for that initial release, at least 90% of them was APS content because we were able to dig down. However, there is a negative to all of this. Now, publishing is, well, let's just say the last few years it's gotten a little rough for publishers. Libraries have less funding. Things are tightening up. So all subscriptions are being looked at in a much more critical eye by the customer. Also, with changing technologies and the way technologies are being applied, whether it's with altmetrics, open peer review, just whole new ideas and conceptualizations, makes it a very, very difficult environment to do your standard business. It's actually important to be flexible, to innovate, to bring new ideas to the table. And it is here that one has to be worried. In some sense, by doing it yourself, of course, you're only as strong as your company is. I mean, we have a very dynamic, very strong IT group, but it's very limited. Okay? As I said at the beginning, in some senses, we're a small publisher, and so we only have a certain amount of resources to put forward. And so the bottleneck, at least in this era, is in technology and the ability to put forward and integrate new technologies with your system. And so even though we have a dynamic group, when you look at the global picture, you have to understand that there's an opportunity cost. You might be able to do something yourself and have control, but at what cost? What are you putting to the side because of the bottlenecks? And I have to say, this is one of the advantages. I didn't want to be all negative. One of the advantages of partnering is that you can count on the expertise of others to help bring forward and do the infrastructure underneath to keep you on top of the technology. Here in my office, we've concentrated very much on open source software so that we can personally build upon everything we receive. And even when we do partner for very specific projects, we insist that the software is open source so that it can be worked on internally and brought up to date as we see fit. So I thought I would just finish talking a little bit about the APS perspectives on partnering. We've just recently sort of sat down and had a discussion about it because of this nature of this fast evolving environment that we're all working in, is that We did. When we were working on our peer review system, it took us 2 years to go from the paper manuscripts or the paper folders to an all-electronic version. Now, of course, that included transferring about 50,000 records. I think we have several 100,000 manuscript records in our database now, interconnecting it with a referee database of about 60,000 people. But during those few years that the transition took place, our websites were totally stagnant. We didn't even get to a mobile-friendly version of a website, which I'm sure many of you have already transitioned to years ago, until earlier this year. And so we had to have a critical look at the way we do business, and we decided that the way we would do partnering is not in the global sense of having a full publishing partner, but only look at very specific projects so that we can then at least control the expectations of what is being done and what we'll be receiving. And so whenever we look to partner, we ask a series of questions. One, does it fit into an existing initiative? Does it better serve our customers or users? And this is an issue of timeliness and also what can be given, what can be brought to the table. How sustainable is it? Of course, how much does it cost? Because also as a society and as a bunch of physicists, we tend to be pretty miserly with our money. And what is its inherent value? How is it going to help support the goals of the society and of our publishing endeavor? So this is the way we're moving forward in the future. And as I said, we're continuing to be primarily our own publisher. And we've made the decision that at most we'll just be looking to partner at very specific areas because, as I had mentioned earlier, we do like the control over our own content. So I thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Anything? Okay.
So what areas have you decided to partner with?
Very good questions. So for those of you who may not have heard, I said, what areas have we decided to partner in? Actually, right now, we haven't made any decisions yet. Primarily, I think what's important for us is the user interface, essentially. What do our readers see? So we're looking at the potential of partnering for either display of altmetrics, how to obtain clear information on our readership, and how to bring information out. We're actually internally working right now on our own taxonomy. We used to use the PAX code, which is no longer being supported by AIP, and so we're moving to sort of not quite a hierarchical, but a taxonomy that we could then incorporate into our platform, and we're beginning to integrate our meetings and membership information with our publishing platform. So members will have a single entry point. So, any other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned library funding. I presume that has to do with the pressures on revenues, but you did not elaborate on that.
Well, it's, I think everyone in the publishing industry is seeing that there's not only a constriction on the amount of money libraries have for subscriptions, especially serials, but there's a true even reduction. It's not even a holding the line. And so even though we consider ourselves one of the top physics publishers, we're finding that we're getting pressure from libraries about our subscription prices. And so we have to find ways of bringing more value at the same cost, or finding alternative revenue sources, such as open access or other things like that.
You said 70% of your revenue was from the journals itself, so presumably that's mostly institutional and not like individual
Yeah.
Seeing that shift?
Yeah, the few individual subscriptions we have are priced extremely low. So almost all of them are from institutional or consortia agreements. So it's, what's interesting is we find that we have subscriptions from a broad spectrum of universities and institutions, everywhere from just the four-year liberal arts colleges all the way up to the major research institutions. Actually, using a Carnegie scheme, I think 40% of our revenues or 35% of our revenues come from Tier 1, Tier 2, which are non-PhD granting institutions.
I noticed you've extended your public scheme now to public high schools.
Right.
What's the usage like?
Well, for the public libraries, we have roughly 800 libraries signed up. So that's out of, I think, an estimate of several thousand U.S. public libraries. So it's a pretty decent coverage. For the high schools, it's much less. We have about 280, 300 high schools signed up. The usage is relatively low.
Ambitious high schools.
Yes. Yes, you'll probably hear some of their names in those Intel competitions, et cetera. But usage hasn't been very high, but at least the accessibility is there.
Yeah, 'cause I know a similar program started in the UK with the
Yes.
Public Licence Society with UK public libraries.
That's right. We've reached out to see if we can participate as well, because we've always had an interest in expanding this internationally. Our problem is, being an American society, is trying to understand what is the equivalent of a U.S. public library or high school or whatever in other countries.
For your subject matter, there's almost no risk.
That's right. That's the thought. Yes?
You described how you went through the process of asking the question about whether to partner. Was it a volunteer and committee-driven exercise? Was it totally staff-driven? Was reports developed?
Yeah. This one was staff-driven. What it was is we have a publishing consultant, and so we meet with her quarterly. I think it was just about a month ago, we had sat down and discussed publishing in general. And the issues that came up was this idea of having serial processes rather than parallel processes, and the fact that we used to have a list of projects we wanted to do. We would call it the semi-infinite list. And the reason why it was the semi-infinite list is it just never seemed to get shorter. It just kept growing. New things would come in as fast as we pulled things off. And so there was an issue of not prioritizing in a narrow sense of short-term gain, but looking more broadly in the prioritization. And then out of that came the idea that some things just cannot be done in a timely way unless we partner. So what would we look for in a partner? And those are the questions. Okay.
You mentioned that when you upgraded your peer review system, it took about 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll imagine even after you get the conversion, there is also the time it takes to keep it up to date and make other changes. Can you share, there's an analysis you have done in terms of, let's say, if you had gone with one of the peer review systems in the marketplace, what the relative pro and cons would have been in terms of cost?
We did a very rough analysis. We do believe that the costs were less by doing it internally. We did vendor out a few of the smaller processes and used them as components that we could plug in. But the real important issue for us was to really truly model our workflow and the way we had done business. We have records from the 70s that have been ingested into our database, and we wanted to keep a consistency within that. We even modeled our editorial user interface almost right off the paper sheets we used to use that summarized exactly what a manuscript was going through. So now any editor, whether they've been there for 40 years or 2 years, can just glance at the front page and almost know exactly where the manuscript is and what are the expectations for the manuscript. So the issue that really has plagued us is trying to keep the technology updated. So that's the one where we haven't really done quite a detailed cost-benefit analysis as if we went with a vendor as to whether or not this could have been done more seamlessly and kept us more up to date. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else?
Thank you very much, Dan.